next slide. And the one thing that we have, and I wanted us to really quickly think about, is our perceptional lens, and that's what that picture shows us: is what do we really see when we're looking at this that object, or when we're looking at a sheet of paper. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. That yes, you're just going to see names; you won't be able to know their background. But it has been proven with different research, and I'll talk about that research, that even names bring up different perceptions of identities of what we think people are based on their names. And so that's important for us to think about and remember when we're doing this work, that yes, we don't know their whole background, but even just the names trigger a thought pattern for us. And that's through our perceptional lens. And what this is shaped throughout our lifetime. We look at it from our cultural learning. So the norms, languages, the values, behaviors that we have, our practices, those are our cultural learning. We look at it through our individual learning, so how we learn and navigate the world just through our own experiences with trauma, our own history, and then really looking at the social and institutional learning. So really, what do we learn historically? What have we learned about different communities and different identities? What we learn about them through our educational system, the power, discrimination, oppression, all of these different relevant institutions such as schools, government associations, all of these things teach us about give us a perceptional lens. So let's go into the next slide, please. And this is where we're going to talk about bias. And bias is a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, a person group compared to another, usually in a way that's considered to be unfair. Biases may be held by individual, group, or institution, can have a negative or positive consequences. So there's different types of biases. We have conscious bias, which is a known and explicit bias, and then we have unconscious bias, which is also known as implicit bias. And that's what we really want to talk about it here, is sort of this unconscious bias and how it shows up, or how potentially could show up, and just for you to be aware of it. That's really what this is about. It's just for us to be aware of our own potential biases. How do we address them so that we can bring our full empathetic self to these contacts, to these calls when we're doing our shift. So if we want to move to the next slide, that would be great. So really, we're talking about implicit and unconscious bias, and really this unconscious bias, it really refers to being the bias that we are unaware of, that's outside of our control. And usually this is informed by our past experiences or learned social messages. So your first messaging that you received from your family, then when you went out into the world, the messages that you received from society, from your school, from your teachers, from your friend groups, those are all sort of like hardened within you to create this sort of unconscious or implicit bias. And then bias is just based on stereotypes, and usually that's based on stereotypes. So like around ethnicity, skin color, gender, sexual orientation, age, weight. So all of these things, of these stereotypes in which you've known about, create this bias for you. Okay, so let's go on. So why do we have bias? It's really to help for us with survival. It's really to help us distinguish between friend and foe. When you think of those simple things as flight, fear or flight, and sort of those responses and how you freeze or you run, that's really a part of in the bias, is how we create that identity for ourselves of how do we survive. We have this perception of what we think these individuals are, and we use that to determine how we survive. It's the ability for us to categorize people. How do we put them into a box that makes us feel comfortable, that makes us feel that we're able to navigate that current situation? And unfortunately, these biases are really built, in the foundation of them are around stereotypes, prejudice, and ultimately discrimination. And so we talk a lot about that, and that's currently what the environment we're in right now is really dealing with. How do we move past this implicit bias to be able to provide the best service? So let's go through to the next slide, please. And so the evidence for unconscious bias and what we're talking about. And so this is where I want people to really pay attention and really think about, is that there is evidence for this. Unconscious bias developed at an early age. Biases emerge during middle childhood and appear to develop across childhood. And these are all from research, so that lets us know where this was studied, and this is how people have developed sort of the bias in the unconscious bias sort of framework. So unconscious bias have real world effects on behavior. Unconscious bias are malleable, and one can take steps to minimize the impact of unconscious bias. So that's a really nice thing about this, and why we bring this to the forefront is that you can undo some of the thought processes behind your bias and your unconscious bias. But a part of it that's taking is being mindful and understanding where your biases may lie, and then really doing active work to address that. A substantial amount of research has been published demonstrating the impacts of unconscious bias in various domains, including the criminal justice system, education, healthcare. Biases may be impacted on hiring and mentoring and may contribute to healthcare disparities. So that's a lot of why we bring this to the forefront, is because this is health inequities exist, and we want to be able to address that by, when we're doing this contact tracing, that we're open to asking the questions that we need to be truly understand all vulnerable populations and the impacts that COVID is having on those vulnerable populations. So we need to be comfortable with us being able to ask those questions, having empathy for those individuals whose identities may not align with our own, but addressing those biases prior to coming in and starting your shift, and being able to hold these conversations in an open and empathetic manner. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the key characteristics of implicit bias is that it's pervasive, it's not in alignment with consciously held values, it usually favors your own in-group, and it's malleable. So meaning that this is, it usually runs a current throughout your existence, and it usually favors the group in which you associate with most and that you favor the most. But the one thing is that it can be adapted, and we can really work to address this so that we are able to come with a complete empathetic lens. Next slide, please. So these are the ways that you can challenge implicit bias. And so I think this is always good to really think through after you have this and before you start with your script practice, is to really think of and challenge yourself. And this work goes outside of the script. It's really pre-script work, pre-shift work, is to really think about how do you challenge your own biases. So one thing is to think about stereotype replacement, recognizing that response based on stereotype and actively adjusting that response. So if you are in a situation where you respond to something based on that person's identity, really checking why, or checking that response to see if it was based on that person's identity and how they're presenting. Counter stereotype imaging. So imagine the individual as the opposite of that stereotype. So whatever that individual's identity presents and the stereotypes you may have associated with that identity, how do you then reimagine that person without those identity stereotypes? And then individuation, so that's seeing that person as an individual rather than a part of their stereotype. So learning about their personal history, not the history of maybe that identity type. So really thinking through, who is this person as an individual? And in a call, you're not necessarily going to have a lot of time to learn about this person individually, but even just saying to yourself, this is an individual that I'm calling. This is someone that has their own issues, and I need to be respectful of that in their own context of which they come to this call. So just even having that little brief sort of talk to yourself can start with that individuation. Perspective taking, so putting yourself in the other person's shoes. What would that, just trying to walk in their shoes and their experience. And opportunities for contact. So really creating and expanding your network so that you are having people from different identities and different outside of your in-group that are part of your community, and a part of your, because that opens, when you are exposed to different identities, you get to see how people engage and interact in the world, that may really break down those stereotypes and demystify them. And lastly, it's partnership building. So reframing your interaction with the person, so that you're able to see them as equals and that you're collaborating with them as equals, is really an important part of this process for challenging and reshaping your implicit bias. So let's go to